It was a Wednesday night on the dead end of Carver Street, where rain hits asphalt and nobody asks questions. The kind of alley where deals are sealed in whispers and debts collected in silence. Rick Walter stood waiting, pinstripe suit, neck tattoos catching the amber of a distant street lamp. His eyes cataloging every shadow the way other men catalog groceries. Automatic, emotionless. 12 years commanding the Iron Serpents had made Rick Walter less a man and more a mechanism. He didn't feel. He calculated. Then he heard it. Not a gunshot. Not the scrape of a rival's boot. Something his world had no protocol for. A sob. Small. Broken. Coming from behind the dumpster to his left. He turned and stopped cold. She was maybe 5 years old. Pink dress soaked at the hem. Blonde hair plastered to a tear-streaked face. Clutched against her chest. A worn teddy bear missing one eye. She looked up at him. Not with the terror a child should feel facing a tattooed stranger in a dark alley, but with something that hit Rick somewhere beneath the armor. "Oh, please," she whispered, her tiny hand closing around two of his fingers. The same fingers that had broken men twice her height. "Please, please pretend you're my dad." Rick Walter froze. In the Iron Serpents, freezing was a eulogy waiting to be written. Yet here he stood, rooted to the rain-slicked concrete, undone by 60 pounds of girl and a one-eyed teddy bear. Then he saw him, a figure at the far mouth of the alley. Dark jacket, forgettable face, moving in the slow, deliberate grid of a man running a search. The kind of man you'd forget the moment he passed, which was exactly the point. Rick had spent his life studying men who didn't want to be remembered. The girl pressed against his leg, trembling. "He said he was taking me to my mom," she breathed. "But I don't know him." She didn't need to say another word. Rick straightened to his full height, adjusted his cuff, and placed himself between the child and the shadow advancing toward them. His body became what it had always been, a wall. Behind him, June tightened her grip, and for the first time in 12 years, Rick Walter felt something dangerous stir inside his chest. Felt disturbingly like purpose. If this moment stopped your breath, drop a comment. Stay safe, June. Subscribe and hit the bell because this story is about to get better. Rick Walter had not always been a monster, but he had spent the better part of a decade perfecting the performance. At 32, he was the youngest boss the Iron Serpents had ever seated at the head of their table, a fact that impressed some men and buried others. He had taken the crew from a mid-tier street outfit running protection rackets along the waterfront into something that made city officials lose sleep and rival syndicates lose men. He hadn't done it with chaos. He'd done it with precision, with patience, with the particular brand of cold intelligence that made him more frightening than any hothead with a gun. The tattoos told one story. The suit told another. Together, they told the truth, that Rick Walter was a man who existed in two worlds simultaneously and was fully dangerous in both. His lieutenants feared him the way soldiers fear a general who has never once flinched under fire. Not because he was cruel for cruelty's sake. Rick had no appetite for spectacle, but because his decisions were always devastatingly correct. He saw angles other men missed. He moved 3 steps ahead and waited, utterly still, for the world to catch up. He had built the Iron Serpents into a machine. Shipments moved clean. Territories held firm. Rivals who tested the borders didn't test them twice. The underworld had a name for the silence that fell when Rick Walter walked into a room. They called it the coil, that held-breath moment before a serpent strikes. He was not a man who wanted for anything. Power, resources, loyalty bought and earned in equal measure. He had constructed a life that left no room for weakness, no space for sentiment, no door left unlocked for anything as useless as feeling. What he had not constructed, what no version of his careful, brutal architecture had accounted for, was a 5-year-old girl in a pink dress materializing from the shadows of Carver Street and dismantling 12 years of ironwork with 8 whispered words. Rick had faced down armed men without blinking. He had walked into rooms where death was the most likely exit and walked back out alone. But nothing in the entire education of his ruthless life had prepared him for June. The figure at the mouth of the alley had stopped moving. He stood under the broken overhang of a fire escape, hands loose at his sides, eyes making a slow sweep of the space between the dumpsters. Patient, unhurried, the posture of a man who had done this before and expected to do it again. He hadn't spotted them yet. Rick and the girl pressed into the alcove beside the dumpster. Nothing but shadow and held breath between them and discovery. Rick had approximately 4 seconds to make a decision. The courier he'd been waiting for was already ghost. The deal, a territory handoff worth more than most men earned in 5 years, was evaporating by the second. Every trained instinct he possessed told him to move, to exit the alley through the north end, to let whatever was happening here resolve itself without his fingerprints on it. He looked down at June. She was staring up at him, both hands still wrapped around his fingers, teddy bear crushed between her forearm and her ribs. Her lip trembled, but she didn't make a sound. She was trying, he realized, to be brave for him. As though she understood, somehow, that silence was what he needed from her. Something moved through Rick's chest like a fault line shifting. He made his decision. He crouched down to her level, this man who knelt for no one, and brought his face close to hers. Up close, her eyes were pale gray, swimming with tears she was refusing to shed. He held her gaze and placed one tattooed finger gently to his lips. She nodded, a tiny, solemn movement. Then Rick stood, smoothed the front of his jacket, and stepped out of the alcove. The man at the fire escape found him immediately. Their eyes met across 20 feet of rain-darkened concrete. Rick didn't speak. He simply stood. All 6 feet of him, shoulders squared, expression arranged into something that had ended negotiations without a single word spoken. The man's jaw tightened. His eyes dropped, briefly, to the space behind Rick's legs where the pink of June's dress was just barely visible. Rick took one slow step forward. The man took one step back. Then another. Then he turned and walked away, unhurried, as though the decision had been entirely his own. Rick watched until the alley was empty. Then, without turning around, he said quietly, "You can breathe now, June." Behind him, he heard the smallest, shakiest exhale he had ever found worth protecting. The safe house on Meridian Lane was not a place children visited. It was a place where men came to disappear, to recover from wounds that couldn't be treated in hospitals, to wait out heat from law enforcement, to be debriefed after operations that never officially happened. The furniture was functional and dark. The windows were reinforced. The men who moved through it did so quietly, with the particular economy of movement that came from years of operating in dangerous spaces. When Rick walked through the door with June's hand in his, the room stopped. 3 of his lieutenants were mid-conversation around the kitchen table. Marco, his head of operations, had a phone halfway to his ear. Dex, who handled acquisitions, was cleaning a weapon with the focused detachment of a man doing laundry. Priest, the oldest of them, simply sat with his coffee and his silence. All 3 looked up. All 3 went very still. Nobody spoke. June pressed close to Rick's side and looked around the room with the careful assessment of a child who had learned, recently and harshly, not to trust easily. She clutched her teddy bear. She said nothing. Rick pulled out a chair at the far end of the table, the one nobody sat in because it was understood, without discussion, to be his, and guided her into it. Then he straightened and looked at his men with an expression that foreclosed every question visibly forming behind their eyes. "She stays," he said. "She's safe here. Anyone who makes her feel otherwise answers to me." Marco lowered his phone. Dex set down his weapon. Priest looked at the little girl, then at Rick, then back at his coffee with the quiet diplomacy of a man who had survived decades by knowing when something was simply not his business. Within the hour, Dex had returned from somewhere with orange juice and a packet of crackers. He placed them in front of June without ceremony, without eye contact, and retreated to his corner. Marco had quietly moved 3 armed men to the exterior perimeter without being asked. Priest, eventually, slid his untouched plate of food down the table toward her. June looked up at Rick. He gave her a single, small nod. She ate, and the most feared crew in the city reorganized itself, without a word of complaint, around one small girl and her one-eyed teddy bear. Marco put the intelligence on the table at midnight. Photographs, surveillance logs, a chain of payments traced through 3 shell companies back to a single source. Rick stood over the spread of documents, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow, and read everything twice before he spoke. The room was quiet except for the distant sound of a television from the back bedroom, where June had finally fallen asleep with Priest stationed silently outside her door. The name at the end of the paper trail was Vincent Caro. Rick had expected it and hated that he had expected it. Caro ran the East Side Collective, a syndicate that had been circling Iron Serpent's territory for 18 months, probing the edges, testing responses, looking for a crack. He was methodical, well-funded, and patient in the way that genuinely dangerous men are patient. Rick had respected him in the cold professional sense of the word, the way a chess player respects a worthy opponent. That was finished now. The operation was elegant in its cruelty. Caro had hired an independent contractor, no collective fingerprints, nothing traceable on the surface, to snatch a child from the West Side. Not randomly. June's mother, it turned out, had a brother. That brother ran a small but strategically positioned crew that controlled 3 blocks Rick had been negotiating to absorb for months. The plan was simple and devastating. Abduct the girl, make it look like an Iron Serpent's operation, and let the brother's grief do the rest. One bereaved uncle with a gun and a reason was all it took to light a war that would bleed both sides dry while Caro absorbed the wreckage. June had not been a victim of opportunity. She had been a calculated instrument. Rick set down the last photograph and was quiet for a long moment. Marco watched him carefully. Dex had stopped pretending to do anything else. The air in the room had the particular quality it always acquired when Rick was thinking. Dense, charged, like the stillness before a pressure system breaks. "He used a child," Rick said finally. His voice was level, almost gentle. Marco nodded. Rick rolled his sleeves down, reached for his jacket. The decision had already been made somewhere beneath the surface, fully formed, before the words arrived. "Pull everyone in," he said. "All of them. Tonight." Rick found her awake at 2 in the morning. He had come to check the perimeter himself. Old habit, something he did when his mind was too full for sleep, and saw the thin slice of light beneath the bedroom door. He knocked once, quietly, and pushed it open. June was sitting up in the center of the bed, The oversized iron serpent's safe house blanket pooled around her waist, teddy bear in her lap. She wasn't crying. She was doing something quieter and more difficult than crying. She was sitting very still with the particular stillness of a child trying to hold herself together through willpower alone. Rick leaned against the doorframe. "Can't sleep?" he asked. She shook her head. Then, after a moment, "Mr. Rick, does my mom know where I am?" He had anticipated the question. He had not anticipated how much it would cost him to hear it. "We're working on it," he said, which was true. Marco had a contact tracing her mother's location. By morning they would have an address. He moved to the chair beside the bed and sat, forearms on his knees, bringing himself closer to her level the way he had in the alley. It was becoming, he noticed, an automatic adjustment. June looked down at her teddy bear and straightened its ear with the focused care of someone tending to something beloved. "His name is Gerald," she said, without looking up. "Good name," Rick said. "My dad gave him to me." A pause. "Before he went away." Rick said nothing. He understood, from the particular weight of the silence that followed, that "went away" was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. June looked up at him then, gray eyes steady and too old for her face. "Do you have a little girl?" The question landed somewhere Rick had kept sealed for a long time. He held her gaze and let it sit for a moment before he answered. "No," he said quietly. "I don't." She considered this with the grave seriousness of someone filing important information. Then she held Gerald out toward him, an offering as pure and unguarded as anything Rick had ever been given. "You can hold him," she said. "He helps." Rick Walter, who had not accepted comfort from another living soul in 11 years, reached out and took the bear. The detective's name was Lena Vasquez, and she was one of approximately 3 people in the city Rick Walter neither owned nor feared. She was clean in the way that made her an anomaly, not naive, not idealistic, but possessed of a particular stubborn integrity that had survived 12 years on the force, 2 corrupt precincts, and at least one attempt on her life that Rick happened to know was ordered by Vincent Caro. That last detail was why he was calling her, and why he believed she would come. The meeting place was a closed diner on Felton Street, one Rick's people had swept and secured an hour before. He arrived first, as he always did, and sat facing the door with coffee he didn't intend to drink. Vasquez walked in at precisely the time he'd specified, another quality he respected, and sat across from him without preamble, without theater, without the performance of reluctance most people felt compelled to stage. She looked at him steadily. "This is either the most useful conversation I'll have this year," she said, "or the most compromising." "Both," Rick said. He laid it out clean. The abduction, Caro's operation, the shell companies, the contractor, the intended ignition of a gang war that would have consumed 3 neighborhoods and a dozen lives on both sides. He placed Marco's documentation on the table between them, copies, not originals, and watched her read with the focused efficiency of a woman accustomed to assembling cases from fragments. When she finished, she looked up. "You're handing me Caro." "I'm handing you the trafficking network," Rick said. "Caro is attached to it. That's your problem to solve legally." He paused. "There are other children, Vasquez. June wasn't the first. She was just the one who found me." Something shifted in the detective's expression. Not softness, exactly, but a recalibration. "What do you want in return?" she asked. "Coordination," Rick said. "Your badge opens doors my methods don't. My resources cover ground your department can't fund. We move together or we move slower than those children deserve." Vasquez was quiet for a long moment, her eyes on the documents, her coffee untouched and cooling between her hands. Then she straightened, squared her shoulders in a way Rick recognized, a person setting down hesitation and picking up resolve. "Tell me about the shipyard," she said. They moved at 3 in the morning, when the city was at its most honest. Rick had split his crew into 4 teams, 12 men total, each with a specific entry point, a specific objective, and a specific exit window. No improvisation, no excess. He had planned the strike on Caro's East Side headquarters the way he planned everything, with the cold geometric logic of a man who understood that violence, when necessary, should be precise rather than spectacular. Vasquez had provided the building schematics and confirmed the location of Caro's holding operation in the basement level, a detail that had made Rick's jaw tighten when he first heard it. She would be positioned 2 blocks east with a tactical unit, ready to move the moment Rick's team secured the interior. The arrangement was uncomfortable for both of them and functional for exactly that reason. Marco led the north entry. Dex took the south. Rick went in through the middle. The building's exterior security lasted approximately 90 seconds. The interior took 4 minutes. Rick moved through the corridors with the particular efficiency of a man who had been in enough dangerous buildings to stop being impressed by them, neutralizing resistance with the minimum force required and nothing beyond it. His men mirrored him, disciplined, quiet, purposeful. The basement door was padlocked from the outside. Rick removed the padlock personally. He wasn't sure why that detail mattered to him, but it did. Inside, in a space that smelled of concrete and fear, they found 7 children. The youngest was perhaps 4. The oldest, a boy, might have been 9. They were huddled together in the far corner with the instinctive solidarity of the frightened. And when the door opened and the light came in, several of them flinched away from it. One small girl covered her face with both hands. Rick crouched in the doorway. He kept his voice low and steady and utterly calm, the way he had learned to do in a rain-soaked alley on Carver Street. "It's over," he said. "Nobody here is going to hurt you. I need you to be brave for just a little longer." Slowly, from the far corner, the boy stood up first. Then, one by one, the others followed. Behind Rick, he heard Marco exhale, long and slow and ragged, and say nothing at all. Caro had known they were coming. Rick had accounted for this possibility, which was why the shipyard operation ran on a different architecture entirely. Smaller team, different timeline, no shared intelligence with Vasquez until the final hour. Even so, walking into Harmon's shipyard at 4 in the morning and finding it lit and staffed and waiting carried its own particular weight. Caro had pulled his best men here. A last consolidation, the kind of move a cornered strategist makes when he understands the game is ending and wants to negotiate the terms of the finale. Rick understood the move because he would have made it himself. He went in with Marco and 2 others, leaving the rest of his crew at the perimeter. For men into a fortified shipyard was either supreme confidence or deliberate provocation. With Rick, it was both, and Caro's men parted to let them through with the uneasy deference of people who have been told to expect someone and are now uncertain they were told enough. Caro was waiting on the main dock, the black water of the harbor shifting behind him, container stacks rising on either side like the walls of a canyon. He was smaller in person than his reputation suggested, compact, well-dressed, composed in the way of a man who had rehearsed this moment. "I expected you sooner," Caro said. "I had children to recover first," Rick said. Something flickered across Caro's expression. Not guilt. Men like Caro had long since made their peace with what they were, but a recalculation. He had expected anger. He was receiving something colder and more dangerous than anger. What followed was brief and entirely without spectacle. Rick had not come to the shipyard for theater. He had come to close an account. Caro's men stood down in stages as it became clear that the perimeter they had trusted was no longer theirs. Vasquez's unit had taken it quietly from the outside, while Rick held Caro's attention from within. The arrest came with the particular anticlimax of well-executed plans, Caro's composure finally fracturing not during any dramatic confrontation but in the simple mechanical moment of the handcuffs closing. He looked at Rick with something approaching disbelief. "You handed me to the police. I handed you to consequences," Rick said. "There's a difference." He left Vasquez to explain the distinction and walked back toward the city without looking back. June's mother was a woman named Claire who had not slept in 4 days. Rick could see it in her the moment she appeared in the doorway of the modest house on Selling Avenue. The particular hollowness of a person who has been surviving on terror and prayer alone, who has not permitted themselves to stop moving because stopping means feeling the full weight of what might be lost. She was still in yesterday's clothes. Her eyes found June before the door was fully open. What happened next Rick did not watch directly. He stepped back, turned slightly toward the street, and gave the moment the privacy it deserved. He heard Claire's voice break on her daughter's name. Heard June say mama in a register he had not heard from her before. Unguarded, total, the voice underneath the brave voice she had been using for 4 days. He looked at the pavement and waited. After a long moment, he heard small footsteps behind him. June tugged the back of his jacket the way she had taken to doing when she wanted his attention without interrupting. He turned. She was holding Gerald out to him. "You keep him," she said, with the grave finality of a 5-year-old making a binding decision. "So you remember." Rick looked at the bear, then at June. He crouched down one last time at eye level, in the manner that had become, over the course of 4 days, entirely natural. "I'll remember," he said. "I don't need Gerald for that." She considered this. Then she hugged him, sudden, fierce and brief, and ran back to her mother. Rick stood, straightened his jacket, walked back to the car where Marco was waiting without a word, which was the greatest kindness Marco had ever extended him. 3 days later, Rick called a full assembly of the Iron Serpents. Every lieutenant, every captain, every man who operated beneath the banner of the crew in any capacity. He stood at the head of the table and said what he had to say without theater and without negotiation. Children were untouchable. In Iron Serpent's territory, no operation, no contract, no sum of money would ever again put a child in harm's way. Any man who violated this was no longer a member. Any outside party who attempted it would answer to the full weight of the crew. The room was silent when he finished. Then, one by one, every man at the table nodded. Marco nodded last, slowly, with the quiet satisfaction of someone watching something broken become, improbably, whole. Rick picked up Gerald from the table where he'd set him, the one-eyed teddy bear who had survived 4 days in the underworld without flinching, and placed him on the shelf behind his chair. A reminder, a rule, a miracle small and stubborn and permanent. The rain on Carver Street fell the same as it always had, indifferent, unhurried, washing the city clean of everything it could and leaving the rest for morning. Rick Walters stood at the window of the Iron Serpent's headquarters, coffee in hand, Gerald watching from the shelf behind his chair with his one good eye. The underworld was already adjusting to the new order, the way water adjusts to a new channel, not without resistance but inevitably. Word had spread, as word always does in the shadows, that something had shifted in the Iron Serpents. that their boss had drawn a line in the concrete that no money could erase. Some men called it weakness. Those men had never seen Rick Walter crouch in a rain-soaked alley and become, for one small girl in a pink dress, exactly what she needed him to be. June had asked a stranger to pretend to be her father. The stranger had done something harder and more permanent than pretending. He had let her in, and in doing so, had found the one thing his carefully constructed empire had never been able to purchase. He had found a reason to be better than what he was. And that is where we leave Rick Walter. Not redeemed in any simple or comfortable sense, but changed. Quietly, irreversibly, changed. If the story moved you, if you found yourself rooting for a mafia boss in a pinstripe suit and a little girl with a one-eyed teddy bear, then you already understand what the best stories do. They find the human being underneath the armor. If you enjoyed the journey from that rain-slicked alley all the way to the shipyard and back again, please give this story a thumbs up. It helps more readers find their way here. And if you want to follow Rick, June, and whatever comes next for the Iron Serpents, hit subscribe so you never miss a chapter. Drop a comment below and tell me, what was the moment that got you? Was it the alley? Gerald? The shipyard? I read every single one. Until next time, stay safe out there. And remember, sometimes the most unexpected people become our greatest protectors.